And greetings. Happy Thursday. Welcome to the Steve Deace Show here live and on demand on Blaze TV, radio, and podcast. I'm Steve Deace back here in Des Moines. Want to thank Chance and Steven and the entire team down in Dallas over the last few days that did a great job making sure that you guys could watch and hear me down there. And I want to thank Tyler and all of the folks, Ricky, for inviting me down to be a part of the Blaze's debate coverage. Always a blast to go down there and to reunite and see everybody. So happy to be back home, though. Happy to be away from the invasion of the never-ending invasion of wasps. It's like Springfield, Ohio, in the studio the Blaze built for me, except it's wasps and not Haitian refugees. Todd Erzin and Aaron McIntyre are there, watching the wasps circle and infest the perimeter. Good to see you two as well. We are brought to you by our friends over at Preborn. If you watched Kamala Harris lie repeatedly about the life issue at the debate last week, there's at least 9 states that do let you kill a live baby. There are no restrictions at all. 9 states in the District of Columbia, by the way. We're one of only a half dozen countries in the world that do this, and it's a pretty good rule of thumb when you're on a list with North Korea and China. Probably not a list you want to be on, right? So that's why you want to be on Preborn's list, because what they do is actually stop this. They defeat this. They confront the spirit of the age and this wickedness right where it is occurring. They're doing literal soul to soul combat with mothers who are considering the murder of their children and then maybe murdering at least a little morsel of their own soul in the process. And they confront them with an ultrasound so that they can hear their baby's heartbeat for themselves and realize that is not their body that they're choosing to end, but that is another heartbeat. It is therefore another person. It is somebody else. But they also know the battle doesn't end there. And they provide these women with all kinds of support because, let's face it, most of the time, that's beginning to change. As more and more we are learning that you must now shout your abortion when it used to be safe, legal, and rare, and a really difficult decision. But still, for the most part, it is women who are not in a secure environment that feel safe about where they are in their relationships that are considering the murder of their children, not women who are. And so they offer those women that support that they need. That's now where the grace comes in. They do all of this free of charge, folks, except the stuff that they provide. None of it is free. And that's where you and I come in. If you want to make a tax-deductible donation, you can do that today. Preborn.com/Steve is where you can go. Preborn.com/Steve. Also, if you want to Blaze TV subscribe, you do, so you don't miss stuff like what we did for the debate and the overtime that we'll do later today and all the other great content we provide exclusively daily for our subscribers here at Blaze TV. We are extending our biggest discount ever, $40 off, 40% off an annual subscription to Blaze TV. Go to blazetv.com/Deace, blazetv.com/Deace, and use the promo code Steve40. Use the promo code Steve40 to get 40% off your Blaze TV subscription. This is absolutely the biggest discount we've ever offered. blazetv.com/Deace, code Steve40. All right, coming up on the show today, we'll continue our Theology Thursday study of Romans in the next hour. At the bottom of this hour, what does it mean to vote like Jesus? A new book tackles that topic, and we'll get into that conversation. But let us begin, as we always do, with what happened while we were away.
What happened while we were away, brought to you by Joe Biden has given up. Biden was in Pennsylvania yesterday touring a firehouse in Shanksville commemorating the 23rd anniversary of the 9/11 terror attacks. He ran into a group of Trump supporters.
Trump, I'll give you my presidential hat. Presidential seal on it.
You want to autograph it?
Oh, sure I'll autograph it.
Huh?
Yeah.
You remember your name?
I don't remember my name. I'm slow.
You're old part. You're an old part.
Yeah, I know, man. I'm an old guy.
And you're an old part, right?
I know you would know about that.
What?
About being old.
No, I know.
All right.
I'm a young timer.
You remind me of the guys I grew up with. There was always one in the neighborhood.
Well, I'm the only one.
There you go.
For those of you listening, one Trump supporter, an old fart himself, asks Biden if he wants his autograph, to which Biden responds no. The old fart Trump supporter then hands Biden his Trump 2024 hat. The crowd beckons Biden to wear the hat. He obliges, and then this happens.
There you go.
That's good, I guess. What's not good in Pennsylvania is this. Back in 2023, Democrats flipped the county government of Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, blue for the first time since the 1800s. Well, why is that significant? Dauphin County is the home of Harrisburg and was an anomaly in the Keystone State for being the only large county that didn't allow people to correct mistakes on their ballots or cure their ballots. Pennsylvania state election law grants counties wide latitude on how to treat ballots with technical mistakes. Many GOP-run counties don't allow people to fix errors like leaving outer envelopes unsigned. Now that Dauphin County has flipped blue in terms of their county government, that new Democrat-run county government is allowing people to fix technical errors or mistakes when it comes to the election ballots. Dauphin County has historically been a blue county when it comes to presidential elections, but this development means any Republican's path to victory in Pennsylvania, especially in that county, just got even more tough. In Ohio, Governor Mike DeWine is throwing money at the Haitians in Springfield. Yep, that's the story. $2.5 million for health care, vaccinations, job search programs, etc. He's also sending in the state troopers for some reason. Meanwhile, at a town hall in Springfield, the father of Aiden Clark, the 11-year-old boy who was struck and killed while riding in a school bus late last August by a Haitian driving without a driver's license, that father of Aiden Clark wants everybody to know how much he really hates white people like himself.
I wish that my son, Aiden Clark, was killed by a 60-year-old white man. And I bet you never thought anyone would ever say something so blunt. But if that guy killed my 11-year-old son, the incessant group of hate-spewing people would leave us alone.
Learning Chinese today. Today's phrase is, what's a quisling?
什么是吉斯林?
Anyway, here's emergency dispatch audio from the Springfield resident who saw some Haitians geesing up to no good.
Okay, I'm sitting here, I'm riding on the trail going to my orientation for my job today, and I see a group of Haitian people. There was about 4 of them. They all had geese in their hand.
How many geese did they have?
They each had 1.
That audio was obtained by the Federalist, who says the call was placed on August 26th before the Columbus suburb, located roughly 50 miles from the state capital, became nationally known this week for epitomizing the nation's illegal immigration crisis. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is attempting to do her own deplorables redux. She tells the Texas Tribune the only reason why this election is close is because
there are people who will never be, shall we say, inclined to support Democrats because of they just have a different orientation toward women, people of color, LGBTQ. You know, they just are not ever going to be there. So say that's about like 30% or something like that.
So Nancy Pelosi says only 30% of Republicans are racist, misogynistic, and homophobic.
I pump those numbers up. Those are rookie numbers in this racket.
WNBA superstar Caitlin Clark liked Taylor Swift's Instagram post the other day endorsing Kamala Harris and got asked a question about her politics last night after her game.
I think for myself is, I have this amazing platform, so I think the biggest thing would be just to encourage people to register to vote. I think for myself, it's the second time I can vote in an election. At age 22, I could vote when I was 18, so I think do that. That's the biggest thing I can do with the platform that I have.
Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes says basically the same thing.
Yeah, I think I've always said I don't want my place and my platform to be used to endorse a candidate or do whatever. Either way, I think my place is to inform people to get registered to vote. It's to inform people to do their own research and then make their best decision for them and their family. And so I think that's every time I'm on this stage and I get asked these questions, I'm going to refer back to that because I think that's what makes America so great.
And that's what happened while we were away.
Aaron's Montage brought to you by our friends over at Relief Factor. Maybe you've just decided to shut it down. That pain level, that achiness, that stiffness and soreness that you have been battling for so long, you're just convinced it's your time. It might be. We all have a time, right? I checked again this morning. Sure enough, death rate remains 100%. So we all have a time, but it may not be your time yet. Instead, it might be time to consider relief factor because it could not be something clinical as much as chronic, too much inflammation in your joints. And that's why a group of physicians got together one day and created relief factor. They got tired of prescribing painkillers. They wanted to come up with something drug-free that would go after the inflammation that is often the cause and the culprit of the reason for your chronic pain. And that something is relief factor. Over the years, over 1 million people have tried the 3-week quick start. 70% of them saw such great results in 3 weeks or less. They've stuck around long term with the product. So why don't you give it a shot? What do you got to lose for $20 to see if you don't see a difference in your pain in 3 weeks or less when you go to relieffactor.com? Try it today. Get the 3-week quick start today at relieffactor.com. Am I reading it wrong? That is this the new Democratic Party's attempt to be moderate, that only 30% of Republicans now are deplorable? Only 30%? Is guys, is that where my standards are, that's considered conciliatory now? Only 30% of us are wretched, knuckle-dragging humans. Only 30%.
I don't know. I saw that as an insult.
Oh, you expected it to be much higher.
Yeah.
There's an election in 60 days. That's it.
Yes. Yes. That's it. Bill Clinton used to move to the middle on issues. The new Democratic Party, the current one, just moves to the middle on and just a skosh, mind you, on insults. Right. So that's how things have changed. I want to talk. Well, let me address this right now. The thing in Dauphin, Pennsylvania. This is why we can't ever get complacent, man. And this is why I don't know what the margin of cheating is. And I mean, there's a lot more detail in the thread that Aaron cited. I was reading this thread on my flight home last night. And and just as we're about to take off, I'm like, when we get to 5,000 feet, I'm jumping. I mean, I just, I know you guys had a chance to read that thread when I sent it to you. Aaron, Todd, did you just not have flashbacks to hanging chads and Florida recounts? Did you just not have
that's
a vision of Pennsylvania, Dauphin, Pennsylvania Democrats just grabbing leaflets of paper, litter off the street, okay, and sitting in a room trying to discern whether this was somebody's gum wrapper or a vote, and then of course it is another vote for Kamala, of course.
If only.
Yes.
Remember the footage though? Out of Florida then? I mean, it was all on camera. These guys looking really closely. I mean, it was farcical, but we at least got to see it. You're not going to be able to see it this time. And now it's like a religious revival. Even the language, the curing. You are healed. Your vote has been restored.
Yes. What a great observation you just made right there. You're right. Because this is religion to them.
Yes.
And you're not, we cannot ever be complacent. We can't, man. And I don't know what the line is. I struggle with it a lot the other way. I want to win badly, but my job is to tell you the truth, and I want to make sure, though, particularly when we're in the heat of a game. I used to coach Noah's flag football teams. And sometimes you need to get guys they're little kids. They're not grown men. And so you yell at them and stuff, it crushes them. On the other hand, you got to get their attention because they're doing it wrong, right? And there's a balance there, right? And I don't want to demoralize you guys that are tuned into this right now. On the other hand, if we all just keep sitting around here, lifting a cheek and ripping one off and, yep, smells like Trump's got it again. All right, guys, we cannot rest at all with this opponent. There is no stone unturned, no ballot uncured, unharvested. This is relentless. It is never ending. It's exhausting. And I know we want to live our lives, and I know this cannot consume our lives. Many of us are husbands, fathers, mothers, wives. We have families. We have businesses. We have careers. We've got loved ones who need us, elderly loved ones who need our time and attention as well. And we just are not in a position to make this a fixation. I get that. And I think that we don't want to be as fixated on it as they are anyway. We got a religion, pretty good one. We'll stick to our own. Thanks. But somewhere between fixation and we got this, Trump's got it again, Trump nailed him again, Trump fooled him again, Trump faked him out again, Trump deked him again, that is always the content that generates the most traffic, man. And I just got to tell you, you have to understand, like even if this last debate had gone the way we anticipated and better, how would they have changed? Let's ask this question. If the last debate had gone the way we wanted it to, and Trump got a knockout blow, how would Dauphin, Pennsylvania have reacted to that news, guys? How would they have reacted? With exactly what they just did. It just kept on. When it kept on going. It never sleeps. It doesn't. So we cannot, there's got to be a balance somewhere, and we can all help each other find it together, but there's got to be a balance somewhere between fixation levels of obsession, which is what they have, and then just complacency. Oh no, we got this. Nobody's got anything. These people are relentless. You have got to keep your head on a swivel with these people. And the replies in the thread are just cultic. Thank you for guaranteeing we're going to win. I mean, they're just flat out just saying this stuff. I mean, it's just, like I said, man, I read this thread last night and I was like, can I get onto the wing and jump without decompressing the entire compartment of this plane and taking other people with me? I mean, it was just... Who was saying the guarantee we're going to win? The lefties? No, we do this all the time. Oh, no. You mean in the replies? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. In the lefties in the reply. Yep. This will guarantee, because of course we can't lose if we actually count all the votes that have not even voted. Yes, absolutely. You bet. Yes. So we just can't get complacent. We can't. And somewhere on the right, there's got to be some audience for, we can do that better. We got it. We did that good, but now we got to keep doing it. Once isn't enough. All right. Because, I mean, they take over this county, guys, and they just turn the entire county into a ballot harvesting system. And they're congratulating themselves for it. That's what we're up against.
Steve, I'm going to go home and think about what you said over some quality video game and toy lightsaber time. I'm going to mull that over. In between duels, maybe contemplate that, Todd, if you don't mind it. As you're swapping out your Kyber crystal, maybe you'll mull that over at least for a little bit, right? Maybe the Force will speak to me.
Indeed. All right. Why do we focus so much on the men on this show?
Because they suck?
Yes. But the men really are really the omen for a culture. You always can tell a lot about a culture by the condition of its men. And I mean, we can entertain all kinds of fanciful theories, and if you're a bitter cat lady, you can jump on TikTok and rail against it and shake your fist at God, but the reality is none of that's relevant. It doesn't change anything. Creation was built on headship. All right? And there is an order to things and an order of things in God's economy. And it doesn't change based on the sages of this age. And so you can always tell a lot about the culture by the condition of its men. I can't even imagine, as much as I adore my own children, I cannot even imagine bearing and processing the grief of outliving my children. Having to bury them before they've reached the fullness of their God-given potential. And I would typically be a person that would say, you can't criticize someone in the process of grief. We all grieve in our own way. But I'm going to make an exception here. Because if you're going to weaponize your grief against me, I have a right to defend myself. If you're going to turn your grief into they sunk the Lusitania, if you're going to turn your grief into a George Floyd funeral, if you're going to turn your grief into a cause celeb, which is going to cause those in the same cause as you to then celebrate undoing my way of life, yeah, I have a right to push back against that, and I'm going to fully utilize it.
Amen.
I cannot imagine also how weak of a man you must be. How much of a poor excuse for a male you must be. And you're old enough to know better. The statute, I have no idea this gentleman's family history, but it's not like we've got a plethora of good dads right now, including him. But you reach a statute of limitations where dad didn't love me enough, dad didn't approve of me enough, dad was too abusive. We move on, and you have to live your own life. And I have no idea this guy's background, but he's clearly reached the age of being accountable for his own actions. This is one of the most sadly pathetic symbols, metaphors for the state of masculinity in America. In any previous era, it would have required action by other men, by the authorities, to stop such a father from giving into the temptation of his rage at what was done to his son.
There's a hit movie about what you're talking about in a book, Steve Grisham, A Time to Kill. That's exactly
Correct.
What it's about.
Correct. And overreacting and taking justice into your own hands before justice has even had a chance to have a say. That is the natural masculine reaction to what the spirit of the age did to your son. I don't care who you are. Unless you're not a man, unless you're something else. You anatomically may be male, but no, you are not going to get to weaponize your grief against me. No, you are not going to get to weaponize your protected status against me as someone who lost their son. Because it's people like me, sir, that have been trying to stop them from stories like yours happening. But the idea that you would rather simp for the very spirit of the age that cost you your son's life than face the natural masculine reaction and temptation to give into the rage that goes with that and to act on it in unjustifiable ways tells you all you need to know about how we got here. The men are the problem, which means the men are also the solution. No other previous era of men, and if no other previous era of masculinity would have even permitted a male to speak out the way he just did, even if you thought it, the level of embarrassment to say something like this out loud would have been so overwhelming. Lindsey Graham called and said, that's a low T level. Yeah, you wouldn't have voiced that in public. You'd have been ashamed to, and rightfully so, because it's shameful. I'm very sorry what happened to Aiden. But it's people like us that are the ones that don't want any more stories like that. He's made himself the story. He's made himself and his simping for the spirit of the age a symbol. to be used and rallied against the very people that are the only ones standing between the spirit of the age and more stories like Aiden Childs. And that's reprehensible. I've talked on this show a lot the last few years about the differences between sinful and demonic. When we are sinful, it is when we exploit that which God has placed in us. It is when we take the natural sexual desires we have and we exploit them beyond what God says to do with them. It's when we take the natural ambitions for significance we have and we exploit them into greed and materialism and oppressing people and using them as human chattel. These are exploitations of the natural drives and ambitions and desires that God has placed within each of us. But when things become demonic is when we abandon them altogether. Where we go from I'm facing the temptation whether to be generous with my success or make my significance all about me or to be humble with it to I won't even take a chance at being successful at all. I mean, that would be a risk. I might lose. Let me just stay in my mom's basement. I won't control my sexual urges. In fact, I won't even ask a girl out at all. I'll just I'll be celibate. I'll be an incel and rage on X all day about the modern woman, one of which I've never actually held the hand of. Sinfulness would be giving into the rage of what the system did to your son, acting on that in unjustifiable ways. Demonic is, I wish my son would have been killed by somebody that it was culturally acceptable to criticize. Culturally acceptable by who? The very same demonic forces that did this to his son. That's whom. That's a simp. That's pathetic. And it also gives me cause to reiterate something I've said a lot recently too. There is no such thing as toxic masculinity. There is only masculinity. And all other male behavior that is not masculine, that is what is toxic. And that's what that guy is. Toxic. And I don't want to hear, well, the feds, there's no excuses for that. That's how we built the country. We founded the greatest country that ever lived on, well, he had no choice but to make himself out to be an a-hole. They threatened him. The men who built, forged, framed, founded this country, they didn't face any threats. No. I seem to recall they pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honors in place of those threats and in the face of them. Now, that's pathetic. But understand, as Todd would say, that's also legion. There is more of that guy in the American home than men, and it's not even close. It's not even close, and that more than anything else is why we are where we are. There's more of that guy in our pulpits than a man, more than any, and it's not even close. And that more than anything else is why we are where we are. There's more of that guy in public office than a man, more than anything else, and that's why we are where we are. And right on down the line we go. For many of us as men, the enemy is the man in the mirror, or the lack thereof. That is pathetic. Pathetic. And there needs to be some kind of law of the jungle. The fact that guy wasn't just laughed out of his community by the other men for that, mocked and derided just right out of the community for that, means you're going to get more of it. And we're going to get more stories and sad stories and tragedies like Aiden Childs as well. So when will we stop asking, where are the men? When they start showing up. Because what speaks in that video may have the baritone voice, may have the right anatomical equipment, might have to shave his face on a regular basis, might have the visual and outer gleanings of a man, but that is not a man. That is a simp. And that's what most men in this era have sadly become. All right, back here on the Steve Deace Show. Let's get right to it. Name of the book, Vote Like Jesus, Answering 15 Big Questions About God versus Government. Out now by Pastor Mark Driscoll. Good to see you again, Mark. Thank you for joining us on the show here, brother. How are you?
Good, buddy. Yeah, it's good to see you, man. Thanks for having me on. How's your granddaughter?
She's doing better, way better than I deserve. I mean, and I'm pretty confident that she's the most adorable thing on this earth. And pretty close to perfection, I might even say, frankly.
That's awesome. We could talk politics, but it's a lot better to talk grandkids.
It is. It will certainly be a less divisive conversation than the one we're about to have, perhaps. Although, if we're going to start arguing over whose grandkids are more adorable, I mean, I'll fight you over that. Okay. Let's even start with the premise of, can we vote like Jesus? When I've looked at this question before, I've always tried to, as in terms of like a Christian voting ethic, I've always actually tried to look at Paul, because he at least had some nascent proto versions of civil liberties as a Roman citizen that we enjoy today as Americans, as Westerners. I mean, ours are way more detailed and advanced than his, but for the first century, they were rather small p progressive. So he really lived through the tension of what it meant to be a somewhat free, in air quotes, citizen, but then also part of a sect of people who were in the world and not of it at the same time. So I'm kind of fascinated. You just went ahead and went right to the big man himself, Jesus, in looking at this ethic. So let's start there. Can you even ascertain how Jesus would vote himself?
Yeah, so Jesus articulates something called the two kingdoms. So he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, the tax, give to the Lord what is the Lord's, the tithe. Jesus, when he's on trial by the government, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. So he denotes two kingdoms. And the reason that he got in trouble with the government, the reason ultimately that they executed him, he said that his kingdom and his authority was over the Roman government and the political leadership. And so within that, Christians have always believed in two kingdoms. That is, that we're a citizen of a country, but our ultimate citizenship is in the kingdom of God. It is in heaven. So our highest loyalty is to Jesus as King, and we need to be good citizens of our nation. We can be patriotic. We should be, and we should love and serve our country and seek for just laws and the peace and prosperity and flourishing of all of its citizens. But our ultimate allegiance has to be to Jesus Christ. And what happens is some people who don't understand that there is a God, they think that basically government has replaced God and that government is the highest and only authority. That would be the progressive left, which always leads to, abuses and totalitarian regimes. For those who are on the right, our error can be, we just sort of use Jesus for our political party or cause. We'll use the name of God, but ultimately what we really care about is our policies and our politicians, and we're willing to sacrifice our integrity or our commitments to God so that we can win elections or we can convince voters. And so, I know that you've lived in this space long enough. You've met a lot of people who say, I'm a Republican and a Christian. You're like, yeah, you're a capital R Republican and a small c Christian, and your politics is way more important than your God. And that's the problem on the right.
Let's go to the end game before we talk about this particular election, because throughout history, cultures have tried to put Christians in the Hobbes choice, the lady or the tiger choice, right? And, for example, one of the historic divisions between Christians and Jews, as you well know, for the first century of Christianity was not exclusively, but largely an argument between Jews about whether Yeshua is Messiah or not. Okay. And so the Titus and Hadrian show up, and Rome is going to put down the nation of Israel basically once and for all. All right. And the Jewish Christians, those who believe that Yeshua is Messiah, they recognize this. They see this as the abomination of desolation, and they flee, right, to, I think, Petra, I believe that was one of the places they fled to, right? And And the non-Messianic Jews, they stood and fight. They stood and fought for their legacy and their culture, and they kind of viewed the Jewish Christians like as traitors, like they turned against that legacy, that clearly they should have chosen to fight the Romans against their brethren. But the Christians viewed that as, that's not our fight. That's not the fight Jesus called us towards, and it's time for us to go. I mean, we're part of a new covenant now, right? So there are moments in a culture where we really can't make this choice, the choice the culture is compelling us to. It's too far gone. You're asking us to make a choice that just completely confounds our Christian ethic. And so I think we're probably closer to those moments in this culture than a lot of Christians want to consider. But what do you think about that?
So, as a Bible teacher, the primary text on government is Romans 13, and it says that, and Romans 13, 1-7 says that God is the source of all authority, and that he delegates some authority to the state, including the wielding of the sword, which is the taking of life in acts of war and such. But in that, it means that government doesn't have innate authority, it only has derivative authority. And so when the government is telling someone to do something that God forbids, or commands the government to do something that God forbids, what happens then is civil disobedience. So if the government says you have to do this and you can't, he's like, I just can't. Or the government says you must do this and you're like, I can't. Then there are occasions in the Bible for civil disobedience. The Hebrew midwives who wouldn't kill the baby boys, that was civil disobedience. When Daniel and his buddies wouldn't worship King Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, that was civil disobedience. When Joseph in the book of Genesis would not submit to a political leader's wife's request, basically as a slave, to commit sexual sin, he went to prison for it. That was civil disobedience. When Paul repeatedly goes to jail, that's civil disobedience. When Jesus gets executed by the Roman government, that's civil disobedience. And so the question for the Christian is, are we being rebellious and just having sort of an anarchist spirit, or is the government getting to the point that the conflict between those two kingdoms, the nation in which I live and the kingdom to which I am loyal, there's so much conflict that I need to stand against my nation for the sake of my king and kingdom. And we saw this on full display, for example, during COVID, when a lot of states and mayors and attorney generals were saying, close your church down. And a lot of churches said, no, you don't have jurisdiction over the church, and God's people will make decisions, and we will not allow mayors and governors and attorney generals to make those decisions. We were one of those churches that stayed open and rolled. And technically, had we been in a place that had those requirements, we would have been practicing civil disobedience. So that's the issue for the Christian is, are we there yet? Are we at the point where, how much more tax money can you give to a government that spends it to sexualize children with government schools, causes, lots of mental health issues on gender and sexuality, seizes custody of children without notification of parents, mutilates their genitalia? How many more abortions can you pay for? As a believer, there does reach a point where you have to ask yourself, is it the time of civil disobedience? And I think what you're intimating is, for a lot of Christians, they're wondering, how close are we to that line? Mm-hmm.
The origin of the Republican Party, for people that don't know, originally there was a faction of people called homesteaders and freelanders and abolitionists and a party called the Whigs. And when it became very apparent that the Whigs were never going, especially after gold is discovered in California, and now we're going to break the Missouri Compromise and we're going to export slavery now to the Western territories and Western states, that is when the abolitionists, the Christians, the Whig Party, they drew a line in the sand and said, you guys at least have to hold the line of the Missouri Compromise or we're out of here. And the Whig Party said, you've got nowhere else to go. And the Christians said, well, I guess we'll just go do our own thing. And they met in a place called Jackson, Michigan, and they formed what's called the Republican Party. And in its initial charter, the initial charter of the Republican Party said it was formed to combat the twin evils of slavery and the redefinition of marriage through polygamy. And so a lot of people are wondering, are we going to see that happen again? A lot of Christians are wondering in the not too distant future, If the Republicans run on a candidate who's just openly for allowing any form of child sacrifice anywhere, and just has not even the Stephen Douglas position, like I'm not gonna do anything at all to deter it, anything at all to stop it whatsoever. If I like his tax plan, can I still vote for him? If I think that he would, do a good job on a few other issues, is that okay? Those are things that I also think we're going to have to start thinking about and wrestling with, minus revival, because it's not like the Republican Party is getting more receptive to us as a whole right now, Mark.
No, on the life issue, this is a watershed issue for people of faith. It is, I would say, a primary, not a secondary issue. And what is really quite wild is the plank in the Republican platform today regarding abortion is the previous plank of the Democratic Party. There was a time when you would hear the Clintons say repeatedly, we want abortion to be safe, rare, and legal. Today, that's a Republican. And so what has happened is the Democratic Party has slid over toward cultural Marxism, socialism. It's the party of death. The Republican Party has slid to the left in what was previously the position of the Democrats. And for those of us who are Christian first, conservative second, and Republican third, we feel like the party has abandoned and left us, and we're further to the right than the party. And so that means we either vote for some protest candidate that has no chance of winning. We abstain from voting altogether. We do like the Anabaptists do, and we exit the political process, which to me benefits no one and nothing. Or you plug your nose and vote for the best of your options. But it does look, if we continue in this slide down and to the left, at some point, my aspirational thought is, and it may not be possible, but it's aspirational, you may need actually a new party that is actually conservative and is willing to say marriage is for a man and a woman. The trans stuff is insane, and killing a baby is always a bad idea. And politicians aren't that nuanced, but for those of us who are pastors and have a prophetic function, that's clear, and we like it that clear.
What about character of candidates, right? So I did a Q&A on my flight home from Dallas last night on X, and I got questions. Am I ashamed to have a Trump sign in my yard? Would Jesus say to vote for the guy who said grab him by the you know what and all that other stuff? Okay, and my response was, to me, I think character is a multifaceted process. For example, at some point, someone's actual, like I didn't support Trump in 2016 because he had no public record. There was just his private character, and I couldn't bring myself to vote for it. But then he became president, and I think that's part of his character too. And people were more prosperous. There was less suffering. We were making peace deals, right? I mean, those are things that positively impacted a lot of people's, millions of people's lives. I think that's got to factor into somebody's character. I'll say this, I one of my best buds just produced the Reagan movie. I loved the film. I adored Reagan growing up. Donald Trump's managed to do something Ronald Reagan did, and all of his children are all somewhat functional, despite growing up in a public, in the public eye. They're all loyal to their father and to his causes. They all get along. We don't see them in tabloids or things like that. We didn't see, any of the Trump kids out there taping themselves to nuclear weapons like Patty Davis did, when Ron was president. That's got to factor into somebody's character too, right? So as Christians, character matters greatly, but how complicated, multifaceted does that evaluation actually get?
Well, again, for Christians, you've got to ask, what is going to be my driving primary decision? Is it personality or policy? And if it's personality, you're going to vote for your friend in chief, the person that, you would like to spend Thanksgiving with. And on that note right now, following the debacle that was a debate, I hate to say it, Kamala actually came off as likable, which, I guess you can call that a miracle. She smiled and she seemed to have a personality, and unlike her boss, she could fog a mirror and is still, not doing weekend at Bernie's as a lifestyle. But on the other side, Trump did come off as, and I'm going to vote for Trump. I'm a conservative, I'm a Christian conservative Republican. I'm going to plug my nose and vote and take my option. But at the end of the day, it's like, did you come off as old, angry, and tired? if you're voting on the personality issue, that doesn't help. For me, though, what matters more than personality is policy. Because personalities come and go, but once policies are established, we have to deal with them. Like the policy of an open border, and depending upon who you believe, 10 to 20 million people entering the country illegally, we have to deal with those people. They're here now. So even when Biden goes, even if Biden was a very nice grandpa and a, dementia granddad and a very sweetheart of a guy, his policy remains and we have to deal with it. And so I think what happens in American politics, because it's a celebrity culture, because of social media, because of sound bites, we end up looking at personality and not looking at policy. And I'm like, okay, what's going to happen to the economy if we have unrealized tax on capital gains? It's going to bankrupt the nation. What happens if we enlarge the government and we're giving away more money and driving up more debt? Well, that's a crisis. What if we don't have fossil fuels and we drive up energy? Well, then we're back into an inflationary cycle because that causes the cost of everything to go up. So to me, policy has to, at the end of the day, drive. And as a pastor as well, and as a Christian, we've all got stuff in our past that we know is sinful and wrong. And so for me, I would tell both candidates, you need to repent of sin and trust in Jesus Christ. And those who acknowledge that they are sinners, those who are willing to repent, those who are willing to come under authority, under Jesus' authority, are people then that we can trust to have authority. If you never repent, if you don't demonstrate any humility, if you don't acknowledge any of your faults, flaws, and failures, and you're in authority, but you're not under his authority, to me, now I'm concerned because I believe that you are a person that is not in the healthiest position to have either a decent personality, which includes your character, or decent policies. And so on both sides, for those of us who are Christians, we don't have a candidate who is repentant of sin, humble, and seemingly living with the devotion to God's authority over them. So for the believer, you're like, okay, I hope they both meet Jesus, but until then, I've got the best of my two options. And I would say focus on policy, not just personality. And when it comes to policy, if you are pro-life, what we're talking about how many people live and how many people die. And to me on that issue, it's like, well, do I like their personality or not? It's like, can that be a secondary issue to life and death, which to me is a primary issue?
Good stuff, folks. That's why you want to get the book, Vote Like Jesus, Answering 15 Big Questions About God versus Government, from Pastor Mark Driscoll. Good to see you again, brother. And my grandkid's cuter than yours. So.
All right, realfaith.com. If anybody wants it, just go to realfaith.com. And I appreciate you, my friend. Thank you.
You bet. Realfaith.com is where you can go to get a copy of the book as well. Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. We'll come back. It'll be, we just had some Theology Thursday already, but we'll give you the normal full hour of it we typically do when we return here on The Blaze. Stay tuned.
It's always a wonderful thing when 30 seconds before the start of the top of the hour, Steve texts Todd and I and says, Aaron, actually this was his words, Aeon, Dodd and you disconnect. No, I didn't disconnect. Our Skype unit decided it needed to do some updates right in the middle of the show. I mean, what better time to do some updates than, when your host is on Skype and it's the middle of the show. So until the Skype machine restarts, does its thing, updates its software, it's just Todd and I for now. I'm not even going to pretend or try to do live reads. I don't have any of that beforehand or in front of me. 10 seconds before the show, I said, best of luck, Godspeed, Todd. But here we are. It is the Steve Deace Show. We are live on Blaze TV radio, also live on Twitter, I think, or X. I still make that mistake. Still live on X. Welcome to everyone watching over there. If you want to correspond with Steve whenever he gets back in action here, you can do that, Steve at stevedeace.com, Steve at stevedeace.com. Follow him on X at Steve Deace Show. I can't remember the handles for any of his other social media profiles, like on Gab, on is Getter still a thing? Truth Social. You can just do a search for Steve Deace. I'm sure that'll work out just fine. Want to remind you as well, because of the censorship over at YouTube, we're trying to push everyone. We're going to be nuking the old account very, very soon. We want to push as many of you who watch this on YouTube over to our new channel. You can find it by searching at Deace Show. At Deace Show. That's going to be our new channel on YouTube. And a number of you, thousands of you, have already migrated over there. And we just ask, if you could typically consume this on YouTube, which thousands of you do every day, go ahead and hit a subscribe. Give us a subscribe over at Deace Show on YouTube. So as we wait, we're at 30%, Todd, as we wait for the Skype machine to update so we can get Steve back on here, whose name is on this show because it is his show. As we wait for that to get going, do you want to react to what you just heard in the last segment from Pastor Mark Driscoll talking about his book, Vote Like Jesus? Any reactions? Because we didn't have time in the last segment to what you just heard from Pastor Driscoll.
Well, it certainly lines up with what Steve said yesterday post-debate about how we handle this in the next 60 days or so. One of his tried and true rules of politics is what happens when things are about issues versus what happens when things are about personalities. And Mark perfectly echoed that sentiment in talking about kingdom politics and how the only personality that matters in full is Jesus Christ, and it is outside of that personality that we pull forth issues. Any other personality is either a distraction from those issues or a promise that you're going to get those issues wrong. And that is something that obviously, I mean, really, the GOP is laughably terrible at that. But why? As Pastor Mark also said, it's because of part of the people that do the job he does. It's pastors are constantly saying, I don't want to get involved in politics. I don't want to be political. Now, you shouldn't want to be a politician, but to say that is rank cowardice, number one, and it just doesn't understand the economy of how things work. Again, the personality of Jesus Christ is the only way you can accurately discern what issues matter, at what level, at what degree of importance. Therefore, when you say, I don't want to get involved in politics, your job by definition can't do that. You can't be a good pastor and say, I don't want to be involved in politics. All politics will ultimately be wrong and chaotic, like they are right now, if you have a position like that.
Yeah, the irony of that statement is kind of the irony of Aiden Clark's father in Springfield, Ohio.
Yes.
He's what he's trying to say, or what he thinks he's saying, is that don't use my son as a political pawn, all you hateful bigots. That is a political statement, you Quisling. That is a political statement. And when pastors say, well, I don't want to be political, that is a political statement in and of itself. It's inescapable. The gospel is in and of itself political. And you're doing yourself, and I'm putting it very mildly, a great disservice when you try to divorce the politics from the gospel, because the gospel is political. It is the most powerful truth in this universe that ever was and ever will be. You cannot divorce that from being political. It must take and have an impact on your everyday life, your teaching, your ministry, and your preaching. Steve, welcome back. You took a longer break there, man. Thanks for that.
Gotta love technology, but you know what? You guys read my mind, because before we got into the text of Romans, I was going to circle back and have you guys provide some of your thoughts on what both Pastor Mark had to say and then what I had to say about Aiden's father in the first hour of the show. So you guys did a great job while our machines decided to update and reboot right in the middle of the program. That's always really nice when that happens. So let's recalibrate here. Remind you that you can let us know what you think about what we think via the stevedeace.com inbox. You can always email us, steve@stevedeace.com. That's DEACE. You can like us on Facebook, MeWe, and Gab. Follow me at Steve Deace Show at X, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and
I already did this already. I
you did it already?
Yeah.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you very much. Well, then let me remind people. All right, let me remind people then about our friends over at Patriot Mobile. If you want to make the switch today, and why would you want to make the switch? Because you're going to get all the same fantastic service from companies who hate you without giving your money to companies who hate you. That's why. That's really the pitch. It's just that simple. All right. Well, there's one more added benefit. How about customer service people you can actually understand? They have a 100% U.S.-based customer service team, so you get that too. So all the coverage from the companies that hate you, you will get. But you won't have to give money to the companies that hate you any longer, and you'll get a customer service team that you can understand as well. You can't beat it. That's a heck of a trade. Take advantage of it today with a free month of service with My Name Steve as your offer code at patriotmobile.com/Steve. Free month of service with the offer code Steve at patriotmobile.com/Steve. All right, guys, you ready to get back into the text here in Romans?
Indeed.
Think so.
All right. We're going to pick up with verse 9, and again, going back and forth between what is faith, what is works, what's works without faith, what is faith with works. Are works a demonstration of faith? Is faith what leads to your works? Is it a distinction without a difference, or is this a very key point to be making? So let's pick it up in verse 9, and Paul writes these words. Is this blessing, the one that we talked about last week, okay, receiving the forgiveness of sins, for example, is this blessing then only for the circumcised, meaning those who have demonstrated an outward, have an outward demonstration of being in God's covenant, which is what circumcision was in the old covenant, okay? Or is it also for the uncircumcised? For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted to him? And this is, I think, a very important distinction. In fact, in Spurgeon's exegesis of this text, he really hones in on what Paul's going to write here next. Was the faith counted to him as righteousness to Abraham? Was it counted to him before or after he was circumcised? It was not after, Paul writes, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised who are not merely circumcised, but also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. In one of his other epistles to the church in Galatia, Paul is going to confront a group of people that were attempting to infiltrate the church called Judaizers. That is what they were known as at the time. And these Judaizers were hyper fixated on circumcision to the point that they thought that Gentile believers had to be circumcised as well. Otherwise, they would not have saving faith in Christ. And in a rebuke, in a very stern and stark rebuke of these Judaizers, Paul writes to them in Galatians, hey, if you love circumcision so much, if you really think that the act of circumcision without any faith or obedience behind it whatsoever is what saves you, then do yourselves and the whole world a favor. Cut your entire penises off. That way you'll be especially holy. Show us you really mean it. All right? And so let me... Instead, in the past, I have let you guys just go right with what your tour guide, in Aaron's case, R.C. Sproul, and in Todd's case, Scott Hahn, who's a former evangelical turned Catholic. I've let you guys just go straight to what your tour guides say about this passage. This time I want to ask a very specific question. And in fact, Todd, I'm going to ask it of you first, because Hahn may even tackle this in what he writes, but I want to give you a chance to respond to what is a Protestant stereotype of Catholicism, okay? Because the Protestant stereotype of Catholicism when it comes to faith and works would say that it doesn't matter if I'm dropping the Lord's name in vain, if I'm cheating on my wife, if I'm mean to my kids. I did the works the church told me to do. I didn't have to demonstrate any faithful level of obedience, anything from the inside out. I could just show external works from the outside in, and those works would make me acceptable. And I think of the scene in The Sopranos where Paulie Walnuts, makes a big donation to the church, to his Catholic church, as basically a make good for all of the sins he was committing as a mobster, while never walking away from those sins and repenting of them. But this was kind of his act of external atonement, right? That is the Protestant stereotype of Catholicism. You think that's a fair representation, Aaron, of what a lot of Protestants think?
Yeah.
Okay. So Todd, I want to give you a chance right from the jump to tackle that question. All right, because this is what Spurgeon believes that Paul is tackling here. That you can circumcise your foreskin, you can circumcise your scrotum, you can circumcise your scalp, you can circumcise your fingernail. All right, but if you don't live a life of faithful obedience, it doesn't mean anything. That the righteousness came through faith, by faith to Abraham before circumcision was introduced. And then he went and got circumcised, not to produce faith, but as a seal of that covenant of faith. So how would you respond to that?
Well, it's fascinating how much this has to do, and I don't know how much of you heard before you came on about how what Pastor Mark said dovetailed nicely with what you said about politics, issues versus personalities, and why the church gets its stance on issues so wrong. Even the particular issues are saying things like, I don't want to get involved in politics, because it's so watered down its attachment to the only personality that matters, Jesus Christ, and got involved in all these other personalities. But you can't, if you're not focused on the personality of Jesus, you can't get the issues right. So to your point, Steve, about how the Protestant version of this is, it doesn't work out that way. I mean, lazy Catholics will just be like lazy anybody else, poor focus on the personality of Jesus, and thus get the issues wrong. But if you have the personality of Jesus right, this is a false dichotomy that is set up, because everything flows from there, and the boxes that you check are because of the fullness of that relationship. And this goes perfectly with what I was going to go with anyways, because here at the end, as he said, regarding the uncircumcised who believe, so that to them also righteousness might be credited. Well, way back in Romans 1, we talked about righteousness, what that term actually means. Conformity to a standard or norm. That is the translation. And as I laid out last week in talking about this, there was a ardent faith of Abraham, but clearly without understanding, in sacrificing his own son. A lot of it was based on premises of the old gods. He just thinks this God is the most powerful, and I'm following this thing through to the end. And this is ultimately a story of not about Abraham's heroism, but about a God wanting to show him his full character. And ultimately, this sacrifice taking place mimics what's going to happen 1,800 years in the future with the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, God's own son. That's the conformity to the standard or the norm all the way along throughout the Bible is Jesus on that cross. Abraham, even after his son is saved, he understands the character of God clearly far more deeply, but he doesn't understand that yet. And so, again, that goes back to what you're saying about the dichotomy that Protestants have, that separation can happen among Catholics, but no different than it can happen about anybody else. If you aren't ultimately going in the direction of understanding the fact that this is a relationship that we are called to beyond all understanding. That is very much the point of this. You are part of something here, Abraham. I'm promising you things that you won't understand. Look how old you are. I'm promising you are going to be a father of all nations. He's like, I don't get it. I've tried to connect the dots. No, you can't. And we have a story in the New Testament. Where can we find this? I've talked about already how the Old Testament speaks forward to the New. Well, in the New Testament, where is this sense of redefining relationship? Well, you go to Mark 12, 48 through 50, where Mary is trying to visit her son, and the Lord replies, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, and he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father, there it is, righteousness, conformity to a standard or norm. Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. This is totally redefining relationship. By that time, listen, Mary and a virgin birth, that story is known on some level, certainly of the disciples. This doesn't diminish Mary. This is this is redefining the terms of wait, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, this person that we believe might just be the Messiah. I have that level of intimate relationship him, akin to his own mother. Now, we can believe in Catholic, we can still uphold the differences between Catholics and Protestants of who Mary is. But the fact that she had a clearly unique and uncertain and a relationship that human minds could not compute was known at that time. And this is the typology of old versus new and how they reflect and inform one another. I think the notion of what Protestants think about boxes that have to be checked in the name of works righteousness are actually, anytime a Protestant makes that, they're diminishing what the definition of righteousness actually means. If you understand the relationship of who the Lord is to us, works can't help but flow. And Pastor Mark just said that regarding politics. He's absolutely right about that. Steve, you just said that yesterday regarding how we have to move forward in this election. You are absolutely right. The same applies here. Not only the same applies here, this is the part that is supposed to govern all of the political discussion. Redefining relationships.
What would you say if to a Protestant who read that text and said, it's not that we don't think works are important. I mean, we've got all kinds of false converts here, and so I'll grant you the benefit of the doubt that if someone who claims to be Catholic and is not living a life of faithful obedience, but is performing the sacraments, is abusing his religion. Okay, he's some form of a false convert to cheap grace dispenser, similar to someone, and the amount of false converts that you hear me rail against that we produced in the evangelical church. Okay, but what would you say to somebody on the Protestant side, though, that would say that it was Abraham was given righteousness through faith. The work of circumcision did not produce that righteousness or faith. Okay. It was the sealing of it. Okay. It was the confirmation of that which already existed, but it didn't actually justify him in any way. He was already justified by the faith that God granted him through his grace. The circumcision was just a confirming sign of that which already existed. What would you say to that?
That can be true, but if you apply the same logic to the sacraments, you would simply be in error. And we actually talked about that earlier on in our discussions of Romans. If you would say that baptism is just the same thing as circumcision, we discussed, well, baptism is actually part of, to the early church fathers, baptism was the faith. It wasn't a sign of the faith. It was, and again, I'm repeating myself, but so an understanding of actually what it is fundamental to understanding the person of Jesus Christ and how through his church he taught us that he plans on moving. It's Steve, you've often said before, God could have done things any way he wants to. He chose to do it this way. And I think you, as a Protestant, as a general claim on that, you say that as casually as that's the color blue, that's the color green. But then when we get into specifics, like baptism, they're categorized in this way that nobody understood works until the last 150 years. The early church fathers saw works much, much differently, and they weren't simply signs akin to circumcision, as you accurately just laid out there.
All right, I'm going to give you a shot at this, but where they really need to be having the conversation we're having right now is in the Holy Land. And that's why we're proud to partner with our friends at Voice of Judah Israel. That's exactly what they're trying to do, is take the gospel back to the place that gave birth to the rest of us, to the rest of the world. And they do that with a lot of humanitarian work, yes, particularly now. With the threats since October 7th that the Jewish people are facing over there. But their primary mission here is to build churches and to spread the gospel and to bring the Jewish people in Israel home to their Messiah in Yeshua. If you want to be a part of that effort, the fields are ripe, the harvest is plentiful there. So let's seize the moment to both empower the Jewish people, both with support, but then also with the gospel, the most potent and powerful message in the history of the cosmos. You can do that right now by visiting their website, vojisrael.org/Steve. VOJ for Voice of Judah. vojisrael.org/Steve to learn more about their inspiring work, blessing, and ministering to the nation of Israel. vojisrael.org/Steve. All right, Aaron, your thoughts on this?
So this is where actually R.C. Sproul is going to have a lot more in common with Todd than he probably will with Steve and I, and Scott Hahn to that extent as well. And this is where I'd probably diverge with him, because he does talk about this in terms of sacrament. And I think this is the pertinent commentary on this passage where R.C. Sproul says, many believers question the biblical basis for infant baptism. Baptism is the sign of the new covenant, and the sign of the covenant has always been given to the believer and to his seed. R.C. Sproul says, these are his words. Baptism is not the same as circumcision, but both circumcision and baptism are signs and seals of God's promise. The promises are realized only by faith, which is true in both the New and the Old Testaments. I want to stop just there. I mean, R.C. Sproul is a fierce believer in infant baptism, actually. He said at a conference about 15 years ago, quote, I think it is a sin. I think it is a sin, and you can quote me, not to baptize your children. God was going to kill Moses for not circumcising his son. It was a very serious matter to administer the sign of the covenant to believers and to their infants. And nowhere is there in the biblical content that principle of solidarity is ever abrogated. So that's, again, a little bit more in-depth comments on his beliefs in infant baptism. Back to his study the righteous shall live by faith. Abraham had faith before he was circumcised. His son Isaac had faith after he was circumcised. The faith to which circumcision pointed was not tied to the time in which circumcision was rendered. The point is that the sign of the covenant is the sign of all the benefits that God promises to his people who believe. Circumcision did not justify anybody. Baptism does not justify anybody. The sole instrument of justification is faith. Baptism and circumcision have this in common. Not only are they both signs of the covenant, circumcision, the sign of the old covenant, baptism's signs of the new covenant, but both are also seals. I'd be interested to hear Todd's thoughts on that, because I think that tracks probably a little bit more with his tradition coming from the Catholic side of things than maybe Steve or I's. Yeah,
and I obviously didn't see that coming, and I, once again, the candor of Aaron not editing and just, hey, this is what I the book I decide I'm going to read, and this is what he have to say, and even in disagreement, I'm going to say it. I'm not shocked that he's saying it, but yeah, it's because he understands that, again, it's not a sign. It is part of the faith. And when the creed is mentioned and lays out a mini history of what happened, of the course of original sin, the nature of Christ, again, the righteousness, conformity to a standard of norm. It's always been about him at all times and on all places to ultimately defeat all sin. Well, a baptism into the faith is recognizing the power of original sin on us, the original curse, the thing that put it in place, that made it this very righteousness beyond understanding that reaches throughout time and place. Well, it has to do that, and it will do that, and it can do that, and it does do that through Christ. But it's just like in Scripture where it's the new Adam. Well, the old Adam was the one where original sin started. Before we can even actively choose sin, we are still sinners that can and must be dealt with. That is part of the faith. It is not just a sign. It is an existential truth of why Christ is ultimately necessary all along.
So I have a question. It's a bit snotty, but it's a legit question I have. And we're running late on time, but let me just throw it out there anyway. Okay. If I'm also justified by works and not just faith, if I'm also justified by works and not just faith, and my salvation is not eternally secure, meaning I could lose it on the basis of not completing or performing the works of obedience God has before me, what is the acceptable level of works that I know that I can accomplish that secures my eternity? How do I know what that is?
Well, first of all, that Christ has told you, and he gives laundry list of the things he expects you to do and not do. But ultimately, this is, again, it's when people ask you questions, Steve, about whether God immanent or transcendent, and what do you say?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
that's the same thing here. Protestants want to pull these things apart. And just like in our previous political discussion, Republicans all too often and pastors, I don't want to be political. That's impossible. They're doing the same thing. They're trying to make these two separate camps. If you understand who Jesus Christ is and his nature, works can't help but flow from it.
That's what we think.
Well, yes. I never said in that.
Aaron, is that not what
correct.
we think?
That's what we have articulated. Yeah.
Yes.
So you have So you have to do works. It's
because it's no longer
it's part of the math.
It's I who live, but Christ.
Yes.
It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me, the hope of glory. He is doing these things in me and through me.
But
I'm not doing things from the outside in. They're being done from the inside out.
The mistake Protestants make is separating those two into two different camps. Catholics aren't doing that. That's something that Protestants have either. I mean, I'm not going to call into question all the motivations, but they're doing something, and the separation that you just inferred is a non-existent one.
All right. There's another separation that is often inferred that I think Paul points out is a non-existent one as well, and I want to address that when we come back. Stay tuned. Back here on a Theology Thursday, brought to you by our friends over at Patriot Academy. Got a special announcement for you. Would you like to join Daniel Horowitz and I November 16th through the 18th? We're going to be on the Patriot Academy campus outside of Fredericksburg, Texas. It's a unique firearms training event that combines handgun defense training with classroom courses on the Constitution, civics, and the culture as well. This will be the first time that Daniel and I have ever done one of these together. It'll be the first time I've ever done one of them at all. All right, so if you want to join us for this event, it's coming up here. It's only a couple of months away now. All right, patriotacademy.com/Steve is where you can go and register today. Spots are limited. All right, so make sure you get yours. patriotacademy.com/Steve. Again, that's patriotacademy.com/Steve. You can bring your spouse, bring your kids, bring your geese. We need something to hunt. All right, patriotacademy.com/Steve. Also, speaking of announcements, our friend and colleague Ali Stuckey's got an event coming up here in a couple of weeks with the likes of Candace Cameron Bure, Rosario Butterfield, Francesca Battistelli, and more. It's called the Share the Arrows event, a day dedicated to equipping women with the clarity and courage needed to navigate today's world with conviction and grace. If you want to bless the lady in your life with this, here's what you can do. There's numerous packages here, from general admission to the all-access premium package. All right, go to sharethearrows.com. Sharethearrows.com is where you can go and get your tickets today. Sharethearrows.com, sponsored by Carly Jean of Los Angeles. Sharethearrows.com.
Hey, before you move forward, Steve, can I button something up on that?
Yeah,
because
up on what?
What we talked about last time.
Okay.
Because when I said works cannot be a part of that, and you both chimed in, we agree with that, I realized that there's an important distinction to make, because I know you guys believe it ultimately in free will, but the way you reacted to that means, like, to me, this is where Catholics see Protestants say that, well, that's you. Once you have faith, works kind of follow through on autopilot, and Catholics believe, no, this is, when they say you can't not but do works, it means that the next phase is aligning your will with God's will. Be perfect as I am perfect. And I think that's, like, Steve, just personally, every Christian knows personally, your saving faith, your testimony, the way you share with it, the way I have no doubts about it, but has be perfect as I am perfect. Has that been your experience?
No, I don't think that's
in your personal life.
I don't think that's terming it as autopilot is not a fair characterization, because we still battle against the flesh. All of us do. It's just that our posture is changed. Where we are opposed to God, now we are more in alignment. Does that mean that doing works that flows forth out of our faith, out of our justification, does that mean that is easy to do and that we're just doing that all of the time? No, we still have to fight against our flesh, but it means that our posture is in alignment with God's, or at least more towards it than it was prior to salvation. So turning it as autopilot, I don't think is necessarily accurate.
I'm just turning it on. Well, this is how Catholics perceive.
Yeah, I'm fine with. Yeah, it's a snotty way of framing it, which is what I just did to you. So I think it's perfectly fair. I got what you were doing, but yeah, I totally agree with Aaron, and that would be largely my response. but this is why I think framed it properly several weeks ago on this. I don't remember how long ago it was. When we argue, just as I've said for years, that ultimately the debates between Catholics and Protestants are not theological, they are ecclesiastical. Okay? Because if you believe that the church has the ability, it has a signature premium ability to be authoritative on the scriptures, then when they define things, you're going to have a different view of it than if you don't. All right. And that's ultimately why when Protestants and Catholics try to settle arguments about veneration of Mary or work justification, they have a very difficult time doing it because we want to argue from the authority of the scriptures, and you guys want to argue from the authority of the scriptures as I don't want to even say you guys aren't. I want to make sure I put this properly. The authority of the scriptures alongside the authority of the church. Are you okay? Is that a fair characterization, Todd? Did I put that properly?
There's nothing pejorative about that. No.
Okay. Well, I wanted to make sure I didn't say that. I didn't want to make it look like you guys were Jehovah's Witnesses and you guys can't read the Bibles for yourselves and the church has to supervise it. I wanted that would be unfair. I wanted to make sure I didn't put it that way. Likewise, I don't really believe when we debate works righteousness, we're really debating works righteousness. I really believe we're debating ultimately eternal security. I think you nailed that ultimately. And that's why I framed my question my way, because I believe I believe in eternal security, and therefore, I struggle to interface a works-based righteousness with that, because then how would I ever know if I've done enough works to be righteous? How would I ever know? I don't see how I would ever know. I don't. Because ultimately that's why I went right to that card, because to me, that's what I think we are ultimately arguing. Okay. Does my obedience play a role in the sealing of my, in the sealing of my conversion or not? Okay. So let's take this Abraham thing. I think which correct me if I'm wrong. I think what you guys would say is that if Abraham had denied, if God had told Abraham, commit the act of circumcision, institute the sacrament of circumcision, and Abraham had been like, peace out, I'm good. Doesn't sound like, foreskin and a bunch of dudes. I'm not really down with that. Okay. But anyway, I'll do all the other stuff you want. You guys would be like, well, I mean, he denied, his conversion, right? That's what you guys would say, right? Fair, right? Is that fair? Okay. God gave him an explicit command. And so therefore his security, his relationship with God, God gave him a specific command on a sacramental level. And therefore his specific relationship with God is in peril.
It's not on they're not the exact, that's what I was trying to say.
Okay.
It's not a sacramental level. They're not equivalent. And this is what this is playing out in the explicit words of
But it was to Abraham. It was to Abraham, right? We don't have baptism yet. We don't have, it was sacramental. It was on a sacramental level to Abraham. It was.
No, because you're just using the word that's not what the word sacrament means.
All right, tell us what you think it means.
Well, I know what the Catholic Church
or what it means.
It's again, it's not baptism, for example, isn't just a sign. It is the faith, and that is efficacious. Grace proceeds from it, as does all the sacraments in various different ways.
Right.
And
right. This is why the Judaizers. That's what they thought. That's why the Judaizers thought we had to circumcise the Gentiles, because that's what they thought. The same thing. That's what they thought. That's what they thought circumcision was.
No, we just got done talking about it. They're saying it was a sign.
I agree.
It was a sign and a seal.
I agree that's
of something that already happened, where the grace.
I agree.
So it's not the same thing.
Totally agree. I agree that's what the scriptures say circumcision was. All right. This actually ties in what I'm going to address next. But to the Judaizer, that's not what they thought it meant. They viewed it as a sacramental act. That's why it had to be committed. Your faith wasn't secure without that. That's the argument they made. They made the same argument. I agree that the scriptures don't line up with that, and Paul rebukes it. But that's what they thought. That's what they thought.
No, they're saying you're not. Part of covenant theology, part of a family, what it means to be in versus out. Mm-hmm. They're saying that sign, that signature, that blood oath, call it what you will.
Yeah,
is part of putting the period or the exclamation point on the true act of faith that happened before.
Agreed. I agree. But faith had to precede that work. Yeah, that's what I mean. Abraham believed and then committed an act or a work. See, we would argue that because Abraham is saved not by anything he has done. His father, according to a lot of Jewish traditions, was an idol maker. He is saved by nothing he has done. He is not seeking God. He's not searching for him. Does not know this God exists. Doesn't just walk out into the pastoral hills of Ur one day and just say, I wonder if there's this unknown God out there that's really the God of God. Doesn't do that. God calls him. God acts. God initiates. God saves. God calls him. God acts. God initiates. God saves. He responds to God's initiation. And his written, and that response is credited to him. He's given faith by the act of God initiating. There was nothing to have faith in until God initiated. God initiated, he acts out of faith because that faith is given to him out of God's initiation. He didn't go seeking it out. It wasn't like there was a group of signs and he did all the math and he finally figured it out. The sign was that God initiated. All right. And then therefore Abraham responded, it's credited him righteousness. And because of that, because God is the one that initiates, because God is the one that grants him faith through the free gift of grace, okay, or grants him faith or the free gift of faith through grace. Therefore, when God said, we're going to use circumcision, it was Abraham almost had no other option. He would just obey that because he is now not him. He's now living a life out of faith. He's in a new covenant now, in a direct relationship with God. That's what we would say.
And I think that's what R.C. Sproul is saying. In the preceding passage before the one that I read that Todd and ostensibly Scott Hahn would agree with, this is what R.C. Sproul says. In our last study, I mentioned both James and Paul appealed to Abraham to make their case. The difference is that Paul goes to Genesis 15, whereas James goes to Genesis 22, where we have the record of Abraham offering up Isaac on the altar. Paul is making the point that Abraham was justified before he offered up Isaac on the altar, and even before he was circumcised. The sign of the covenant, circumcision, was not the ground of Abraham's justification. It was the imputed righteousness of Christ. When Abraham believed in the promise of God, God counted him righteousness. So Paul is arguing that Abraham was not justified by works, nor was he justified by circumcision. All right.
This argument's going to continue on a couple more chapters. So let's put a pin in this one for now. There's one more thing that I want to address. One of the earliest heresies in the church was this idea that, and a lot of people believe this today, that the God of the Old Testament was different than the God of the New Testament. And they're not the same. Or one of the arguments that non-Messianic Jews have made against Christianity for many, many years is that, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. He doesn't contradict himself. And these are totally new teachings. This is totally something different than what was revealed to Moses. And I am going to, by what Paul writes here, I'm going to push back on that. And Spurgeon highlights this too, so I want to do the same. The reality is, it's been a covenant of faith all along. Just as Paul points out, the Bible says Abraham is credited righteousness via faith before circumcision is introduced. All right. Abraham is credited righteousness through faith before circumcision is introduced. The law would not come for hundreds of more years. And so already we are operating under a covenant of faith. That has not changed. That's not changed. It's been the same all the way through. This is what the entire book of Hebrews is all about, for example. All right. What law did Moses obey when after God spoke to him, again, just like with Abraham, God initiates. Moses is not out in the fields as a shepherd. He doesn't have, I've got an intuition. I heard this really cool message or this slam and pray song, or I read this pithy saying that there was going to be this burning bush that was going to speak to me. And so I'm just going to go out and seeking this burning bush. Nope. He's not looking. God initiates. God comes to him through a burning bush. All right. Abraham then, same pattern. Go to Pharaoh, tell him to let my people go. All right. Goes. Acts on faith and goes. He doesn't know what a Levitical law is. This has not been revealed to him. None of this has yet. There's no 10 Commandments. None of it. None of this exists yet. And Moses acts on faith after God, same pattern. God initiates supernaturally. Moses then responds. He turns from the life he had. Abraham turns from the life he had in Ur and leaves. Turns in a totally different direction. Moses turns from the life that he had as a shepherd and turns in a totally different direction and goes back to Egypt where he once came from. with a totally different message. He has no idea what the law is, doesn't know this yet. None of this has happened yet. It won't happen. They've been practicing circumcision for a few hundred years. And there's even an issue with Moses being disobedient with that, by the way, that, as Todd alluded to earlier, that God had to confront. But there is no, the law as it would define the Jewish people does not yet exist. And yet Moses responds via faith. Where did he get this faith? Did he do some metaphysical math? No. It was granted to him by his response to God's supernatural initiative or taking of the initiative in reaching out to him. The same pattern works all the way through. This has always been about faith. The currency of the kingdom of God has always been faith, always in the end.
But when it's attributed to you as righteousness, again, what is righteousness? It is conformity to a standard or norm.
Right.
That is the language of the Bible.
Correct. I agree with that wholeheartedly. The question is, which direction does that equation flow from? But that is separate from the point that I wanted to raise here ultimately, which is that the Christian argument that this has been that God has operated on faith all along. That's not something new that just began with the Gospels. That's not true. That theme flows all the way from the Scriptures. Abraham is in Genesis, the very first book of the Bible.
I agree. I'm not trying to distract from that, but in the examples, immediately what is required from that? Action. God requires do this. What if they didn't? They're in the Bible because they did. But as you said, many other haven't, and many other Christians claim, ultimately in each of our own lives. Yeah, your testimony is so out there in the open, Steve. Your testimony of what actually happened to you, I don't deny it for a second, but you've also testified the times in your life where you came crashing up against it. Well, what happened if it would have gone another way? And that this is ultimately where, on every day, are we supposed to work out our faith with fear and trembling? Well, how do we do that? What does that mean? Yes, God initiates, but what's the path after that?
I thought this was a good one.
Yeah.
I enjoyed this conversation. I thought it was good stuff. All right, we're going to stick around, and Anastasia will join us for 3 non-political questions in the overtime for Blaze TV subscribers. For the rest of you, see you tomorrow. Until then, Romans 8:28.